The violation began subtly, insidiously, a single, ice-cold puff of air expelled against the vulnerable nape of my neck as I stood isolated at my kitchen sink, scrubbing the remnants of a solitary dinner plate long after the witching hour had claimed the world outside my window. The ceramic plate slipped from my suddenly nerveless fingers, crashing into the stainless steel basin with a jarring, cacophonous clang that shattered the fragile illusion of domestic peace. And I whirled around, heart lurching violently against my ribs like a trapped bird trying to beat its way out of a cage. My breath catching in a ragged gasp, eyes wide and desperately scanning the familiar space. The empty archway leading to the darkened hall, the silent digital clock casting its indifferent green glow, the refrigerator humming its mundane tune that now sounded like the low growl of a hidden predator. Finding nothing, absolutely nothing, yet the distinct lingering chill on my damp skin felt like the kiss of death itself. A violation so intimate and inexplicable it rooted me to the linoleum floor, trembling uncontrollably, my ears straining beyond the frantic drumming of my own pulse for any betraying sound. A shuffling footstep, a suppressed chuckle, the faintest intake of breath, not my own, encountering only a suffocating silence that now pulsed with a watchful, malevolent awareness, thick as tar. I rationalized it fiercely, a draft from the ill-fitting window, a misfiring nerve ending, the lingering tendril of a forgotten nightmare. But the icy imprint remained, a ghostly brand whispering of something profoundly wrong, something that had noticed me. It returned with cruel precision the very next night, not as an ambiguous chill, but as a focused, deliberate stream of frigid air directed onto the sweat-beaded skin just below my hairline while I hunched over a novel on the living room couch, followed instantly by the unmistakable featherlight brush of something insubstantial yet undeniably present, like cobwebs spun from glacial mist, dragging across my exposed vertebrae. I screamed, a raw, guttural sound ripped from my throat as I flung myself sideways, scrambling backwards off the cushions, the book tumbling forgotten to the floor, my gaze darting in terrified arcs across the lamp-lit room, scrutinizing the empty armchair's plaid fabric. The blank, dark eye of the television screen, the innocuous floral pattern of the drawn curtains, finding only the deepening shadows in the corners that seemed to writhe and coil with a life of their own, stretching towards me like grasping fingers. Denial became a luxury I could no longer afford. This phantom breath, this unseen exhalation from a maw I couldn't fathom, began to stalk me relentlessly beyond the perceived sanctuary of my home. It ambushed me in the harsh, sterile fluorescence of the supermarket aisle, a sudden localized Arctic blast hitting my neck while I compared nutritional labels on cereal boxes, causing me to drop the carton with a clatter that drew annoyed, impatient glances from fellow shoppers, oblivious to my silent terror. It haunted me at a red light, a wet, icy sigh injected directly into my ear canal, cold enough to sear, making me jerk the steering wheel violently and slam the horn, inciting furious shouts and gestures from the driver behind, whose angry face blurred into insignificance against the chilling intimacy of the assault. It violated the false privacy of the office restroom stall, a damp gelid exhalation ghosting over my nape as I frantically scrubbed trembling hands under the lukewarm water, forcing me to flee into the corridor with soap still slick and unrinsed between my fingers, leaving damp, panicked smears on the chrome door handle. Sleep transformed from refuge into a nightly siege I approached with dread, lying rigid in the oppressive darkness. Blankets pulled taut under my chin like a flimsy shield. I'd feel the mattress depress with agonizing slowness near my feet, a subtle, undeniable yielding, as if unseen ponderous weight had settled there, followed by the excruciatingly deliberate progression of that impossible cold breath creeping up the length of the bed, inch by torturous inch, pausing with horrifying precision directly behind the exposed curve of my skull, hovering mere millimeters away, breathing rhythmically onto the sensitive skin, a cadence slow, deliberate, and utterly alien, never syncing with my own shallow, terrified gasps, a presence so crushingly palpable I could almost visualize the shape of spectral lips forming that glacial air, feel the vacuum pull of an inhalation drawing the warmth from my very soul. Turning my head, a monumental act requiring reserves of courage fueled solely by escalating panic, always revealed only empty, impenetrable darkness, a void that seemed to absorb the faintest sliver of light and mock my escalating hysteria with its profound, indifferent emptiness. The entity escalated its torment, graduating from ephemeral brushes to distinct, bone-chilling pressures. A single arctic fingertip tracing the delicate line of my jawbone with possessive, lingering slowness, leaving a trail of numbness in its wake. The unmistakable heavy imprint of a skeletal hand settling briefly, with impossible physical weight, on my left shoulder as I mechanically stacked plates into the dishwasher, the invasive cold sinking deep into muscle and marrow, causing my arm to go momentarily limp, the sensation of long, impossibly frigid strands of hair catching against my cheek and neck as I bent to tie a shoelace, accompanied by a faint, nauseating odor of ozone and damp, freshly turned earth, as if something had clawed its way up from deep below. Mirrors became instruments of pure terror, reflecting not just my own increasingly haggard face, but the potential for something standing immediately behind my reflection, a shape coalescing from the gloom just outside the frame, its breath perhaps fogging the glass where my own reflection's breath should be. I began to avoid them entirely, covering them with cheats, turning them to face walls, terrified of the confirmation I both dreaded and morbidly expected. Isolation became my only strategy, a suffocating armor and a desolate prison. Confiding felt impossible. Who could possibly believe the tale of an unseen breather, a phantom solely focused on exhaling icy dread onto one specific neck? The risk of derision, of being labeled hysterical or insane, paled only in comparison to the unthinkable terror of someone else believing and becoming ensnared in the same invisible hell. The entity, its sentience now a horrifying certainty, seemed to gorge itself on my escalating fear, its manifestations growing bolder, more cruel, more creatively sadistic. It began to mimic the voices of those I held dear. My mother's gentle, concerned call drifting up from the empty, pitch-black basement stairs. "Honey, are you all right?" My best friend Mark's familiar laugh echoing with unnatural clarity from within my utterly dark, locked bedroom closet, always cut off abruptly by that signature, localized gust of paralyzing cold against my neck, a cruel punctuation mark emphasizing my utter aloneness. Whispers commenced, not carried on the air but seemingly generated inside the bone of my skull, or directly within my ear canal, dry and rasping, like beetles scuttling over ancient parchment. Fragmented words and phrases slithering into my consciousness. Closer now. Almost time. Feel you trembling. Mine, always mine. promises that coiled like venomous snakes in the pit of my stomach, chilling me far deeper than the external frost. The cold became a constant personal winter centered solely on me, a perverse microclimate. Even in the sweltering, oppressive humidity of midsummer, my neck and shoulders remained perpetually goose-fleshed, aching with a deep, marrow-deep chill that no amount of thick woolen scarves, worn indoors like a badge of madness, no roaring fire in the hearth even in July, no scalding shower could hope to penetrate. The breath, the touches, the creeping cold defied all barriers. They seeped through layers of clothing as if they were mist, ignored salt lines poured with desperate precision across every threshold and windowsill. The crystals merely grew damp and clumped uselessly, laughed at iron nails driven deep into the door frames, which sometimes hummed with a strange dissonant frequency but offered no protection, passed through locked doors and drawn curtains as if they were insubstantial as thought. Desperation drove me down increasingly esoteric and dark alleys of research, ancient warding symbols painstakingly drawn in charcoal on the floors beneath my bed, only to smudge inexplicably into menacing, unrecognizable shapes by morning. Bundles of protective herbs hung above doorways that withered and turned black overnight, exuding a sickly sweet odor of decay. Frantic, tear-choked prayers whispered to saints, deities, and nameless powers I barely remembered or believed in, dying unanswered in the thick, heavy air of my apartment, which always seemed to hold its breath, listening. My physical deterioration mirrored my mental collapse. The reflection I could no longer bear to see would have shown a hollow-eyed wraith, skin stretched taut and sallow over sharpening cheekbones, hair lank and lifeless, posture perpetually hunched as if under an invisible weight, the very picture of a soul being methodically devoured by an unseen, insatiable predator. The crushing isolation was a torment almost equal to the entity's touch, a constant weight pressing on my chest. Knowing this invisible, intimate hell was mine alone to endure, that speaking might only paint a target on the back of someone I loved, condemning them to share this waking nightmare. The whispers evolved from fragmented taunts into coherent, vile sentences dripping with malice and impossible, intimate knowledge. It recounted childhood humiliations I'd buried decades deep, secrets I had sworn never to tell, described the exact shade of my sister's eyes with unnerving accuracy before whispering what it would do to them when it was done with me. It detailed the agonies it planned to inflict, not just physically but psychically, promising to unravel my mind thread by thread, to make me feel every second of my own dissolution. It promised visits to my elderly parents, described the layout of their sunlit kitchen with chilling precision. The breathing became a near constant, maddening companion, a wet, rasping inhalation and exhalation perpetually suspended just behind my right ear. A sound that bypassed my eardrums and vibrated directly within my skull, drowning out music, muffling the voices of colleagues into unintelligible murmurs, even overpowering my own frantic internal monologue. A relentless, inescapable metronome of dread that marked the excruciating passage of each second, each minute, each hour of my dwindling existence. Exhaustion became a tangible entity itself, dragging at my limbs like lead weights, sanding the sharp edges of my thoughts until only a dull, terrified haze remained, making me clumsy, dropping keys, spilling coffee, stumbling on flat surfaces, perpetually hovering on the precipice of tears or hysterical screams, my nerves frayed wires sparking in the damp. I retreated completely, a modern-day hermit barricaded within the walls of my own home. Heavy blackout curtains remained perpetually drawn against the accusing, normal world outside. Every lamp, overhead light, and candle blazing day and night in a futile, desperate war against the encroaching gloom that seemed to pool thicker and darker in the corners, cling with viscous tenacity to the undersides of tables and chairs, and seep like cold smoke from the very cracks in the plaster. The entity's touches turned actively malicious, graduating from cold pressures to sharp, invasive violations. Needle-sharp pinpricks of intense cold that stabbed deep into my neck and shoulders, leaving behind phantom bruises that bloomed like livid purple flowers beneath the skin, aching with a deep, persistent throb. The sensation of invisible claws, razor-edged and freezing, lightly scoring my collarbone, tracing intricate burning paths of icy fire across my back that seared without ever breaking the surface, leaving trails of invisible agony. The pressure behind me solidified into a constant crushing presence, a looming wall of intangible malice and glacial cold pressing relentlessly against my spine, bending my posture into a perpetual defensive cringe. Its breath now a continuous nauseating river flowing down my collar, carrying that indefinable scent, ozone, wet stone, and beneath it, the cloying sweetness of decay like forgotten flowers rotting in a sealed tomb. I knew with an absolute certainty that settled like permafrost in the deepest core of my being, that it was waiting, savoring my unraveling with the rapt attention of a connoisseur appreciating a complex vintage wine, delighting in the visible tremors that constantly racked my hands, the violent flinch that seized me at the innocent settling groan of old plumbing, the constant icy film of sweat on my forehead and upper lip despite the artificial heat, the silent tears that welled and froze into salty tracks on my cheeks before they could fall. It wanted me utterly hollowed out, a fragile vessel cracked and empty, devoid of the last vestiges of hope or flicker of resistance, perfectly primed, seasoned by terror for its final unspeakable act of possession. The night it enacted its culmination, the very atmosphere within the apartment underwent a terrifying transformation. The air itself seemed to congeal, thick and gelid, pressing in from all sides with a physical smothering weight that made each inhalation a laborious struggle, as if breathing cold syrup. The relentless wet rasping breath that had been my constant tormentor for weeks ceased abruptly, plunging the brightly lit rooms into an absolute suffocating silence far more terrifying than any sound. A vacuum so profound it seemed to pull at my eardrums, amplifying the frantic, runaway thudding of my own heart into a deafening drumbeat against the oppressive quiet. Then came the point of absolute violation. A single excruciatingly cold fingertip, sharp as a shard of diamond ice, pressed with impossible crushing force into the exact center of my spine, just below the base of my skull, the medulla oblongata. It was a locus of absolute zero, radiating paralyzing cold through every nerve fiber, flooding my system with an invasive locking frost that rooted me to the spot more effectively than any chains. Movement was utterly impossible, not just crippling fear, but this invasive glacial energy seized my muscles, flooded my bones, locked my joints. Slowly, agonizingly, with a deliberate predatory savoring, I felt the entity lean in, its vast, formless, freezing presence enveloping me from behind like a shroud woven from liquid nitrogen and pure darkness, merging seamlessly with my own elongated, grotesquely quivering shadow cast by the relentless overhead light. The cold became all-consuming, a burning, soul-deep agony that stole my breath, crystallized my thoughts into frozen shards of pure terror, and then bypassing the medium of air entirely, vibrating directly within the ossicles of my inner ear, resonating in the very core of my skull and marrow of my bones, came the voice. Not a sound heard, but a physical presence felt like continents grinding against each other, glaciers carving into a silent sea, ancient beyond the concept of time and saturated with infinite, pitiless cosmic cruelty, uttering just one word, a word that flooded every cell of my being with a despair so absolute, so profound it shattered the last fragile vestige of my sanity, like glass beneath a hammer, mine. The darkness didn't descend. It erupted not as a passive absence of light, but as a tangible, sentient, freezing entity, thick as primordial tar and cold as the absolute void between dying stars. It rushed in, pouring into my gaping mouth with the force of a torrent, forcing itself down my constricted throat like frozen sludge, invading my flaring nostrils, flooding my sinuses with icy fire, searing my eyes from within with glacial agony, filling me, consuming me cell by frozen cell, molecule by molecule, extinguishing my consciousness, my identity, my very self from the inside out, like a fragile candle flame plunged into the heart of a glacier. The very last sensory fragment my obliterating consciousness registered, before the consuming sentient cold and the suffocating, devouring dark annihilated everything that had ever been me, was not the triumphant, icy sigh I had come to expect, but a single, soft, startlingly warm breath, impossibly, horrifyingly, perversely warm, gently, almost tenderly expelled against the now eternally frigid, lifeless skin of my own neck, the ultimate, intimate signature of its absolute and eternal possession. Story number 2. The ornate music box arrived on Elena's doorstep the Tuesday after her grandmother's funeral, wrapped in faded velvet and tied with a brittle black ribbon. No note, no return address, just the unsettling weight of it in her hands and the faint, metallic scent of old blood clinging to the fabric. It shouldn't have been a surprise. Agatha was notoriously eccentric, her sprawling Victorian mansion brimming with peculiar artifacts, whispered about in hushed, fearful tones by the townsfolk. But the sheer wrongness radiating from the parcel made Elena's skin prickle like static before a storm. Driven by a morbid curiosity stronger than her unease, she carried it inside. The velvet, unnervingly cold even through her sweater, and placed it on the scarred oak dining table beneath the flickering glare of the single pendant light. The ribbon disintegrated at her touch, crumbling to dust that smelled faintly of grave soil, revealing a box carved from obsidian black wood, its surface inlaid with intricate silver patterns that seemed to writhe and coil in the dim light if she stared too long. Hesitantly, her fingers trembling, she found a tiny tarnished silver clasp shaped like a skeletal hand and flipped it open. The lid creaked upwards on protesting hinges, releasing not music but a wave of frigid air and the sudden overpowering sensory assault of a memory that wasn't hers. The cloying sweetness of decayed roses, the sharp tang of panic sweat, the deafening roar of blood in terrified ears, and the visceral thud of a frantic heartbeat hammering against ribs like a trapped bird, gasping. Elena staggered back, the phantom sensations clinging like cobwebs, her own heart racing in sync with the remembered terror. Before she could slam the lid shut, the intricate silver gears inside, slick with something dark and viscous that wasn't oil, began to turn with a grinding, bone-chilling scrape. No melody emerged. Instead, a low guttural whispering seeped into the room, a chorus of fractured voices speaking over each other in languages she didn't recognize, filled with anguish, fury, and desperate pleas that crawled up her spine and burrowed into her skull. Non lasciarmi qui, one voice sobbed in ragged Italian. Sie kommen aus den Wandern. Another rasped in guttural German, thick with dread. The bones! Beneath the roses. She knows. A third hissed in chillingly clear English, the voice brittle and ancient. Elena clapped her hands over her ears, but the whispers weren't sound. They were thoughts, memories forced directly into her mind, vivid and horrifying. She saw flashes. A moonlit garden choked with thorny black roses. A pale hand, Agatha's hand, decades younger, desperately clawing at loose earth. The glint of a tarnished silver locket, identical to the clasp, being buried deep. And then the suffocating darkness of a shallow grave, the gritty taste of soil filling her mouth, the paralyzing terror of being buried alive. The music box wasn't playing music, it was playing Agatha's hidden memories, her deepest, darkest secrets, the sins she'd literally buried. The whispering intensified, becoming a cacophonous shriek inside Elena's head. She saw more the face of a young woman, contorted in agony, dirt packed into her screaming mouth, the gleam of a shovel in moonlight wielded by a younger, harder-faced Agatha, her eyes devoid of remorse, the frantic, futile struggle beneath the earth. Each vision was accompanied by the raw, unprocessed emotion, the victim's bottomless terror, Agatha's cold, calculated fury, the crushing weight of guilt that came later. Elena vomited onto the floor, the acidic burn barely registering against the psychic onslaught. She lunged for the box, intending to smash it, to silence the horrific inheritance, but as her fingers touched the cold wood, a final, overwhelming memory engulfed her. Not sight or sound this time, but pure, unadulterated sensation. She was the woman in the grave. The icy soil pressed down on her chest, stealing her breath. The gritty texture filled her nose, her throat. Panic, pure and blinding, exploded through every nerve. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. Above, the silhouette of Agatha blocked the moon, methodically shoveling dirt onto her face. The thud of each spadeful landing was the loudest sound in the universe. The darkness was absolute, smothering. The air was gone. Her lungs burned like fire. The terror was infinite. A white-hot agony of knowing this was the end, buried alive by someone she must have trusted. As the suffocation reached its peak, the memory fractured, but the lingering sensation of dirt in her lungs, the phantom weight crushing her chest, remained, a permanent, horrifying tattoo on her psyche. The whispering in the room ceased abruptly. The gears ground to a halt. Silence descended, thick and heavy, broken only by Elena's ragged, panicked breaths and the frantic hammering of her own heart, now forever echoing the terrified rhythm of the murdered woman buried beneath the black roses. She stared at the now quiet box, its obsidian surface seeming to drink the light. It wasn't just a gift. It was a curse. A psychic time capsule containing the moment of death. Agatha hadn't just hidden the body, she'd somehow trapped the victim's final, agonizing moments, her own guilt and twisted satisfaction, within this ornate prison. And now she'd passed this poisoned heirloom to Elena. The cold radiating from the box intensified, seeping into Elena's bones. A new horrifying realization dawned. The whispering hadn't stopped. It had simply gone internal. The fractured voices, the suffocating terror, the image of the shovel rising and falling. They were inside her now, swirling in the back of her mind like malevolent ghosts waiting to surface. She could feel them, faint but persistent, a constant, low-level hum of borrowed horror. The box was merely the key that had unlocked them, pouring Agatha's gruesome secret and the victim's final agony directly into her soul. It wasn't just playing memories, it had implanted them. Touching the box felt like touching ice, but a deeper chill settled within her. How many other memories were locked in there? How many other victims lay beneath Agatha's manicured gardens? The compulsion was terrifying, illogical, but undeniable. Her hand, seemingly of its own volition, drifted back towards the obsidian wood. The skeletal clasp felt colder than before. A single desperate whisper, thin and broken, echoed not in the room but within her own thoughts. "Please, find me." It was the victim's voice, a raw plea from beyond the grave, now resonating in Elena's stolen memory. Could she ignore it? Could she live with this horrifying knowledge festering inside her? Could she live with the constant echo of that suffocation, the phantom dirt in her lungs? The ornate box sat on the table, a silent, malevolent presence. It wasn't just a gift with a memory, it was a living tomb, and Elena was now its unwilling caretaker, haunted not by ghosts in her house, but by the ghosts in her own mind, screaming silently from the borrowed grave of her grandmother's victim. The silence stretched, thick with the unspoken terror now residing within her. Every creak of the old house sounded like shifting earth. Every shadow seemed to deepen into the absolute blackness of that buried coffin. The phantom pressure on her chest returned, a constant, suffocating reminder. The victim's whispered plea, "Please, find me," looped in her mind, a broken record of despair. Agatha's cold, remorseless eyes from the memory haunted her waking vision. Elena knew with a chilling certainty that settled deep into her marrow that this wasn't over. The box had delivered its primary payload, but its influence lingered, a psychic poison altering her perception. Sleep was impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she was back in the dirt, tasting soil, feeling the crushing weight, hearing the relentless thud of the spade. The boundary between her own memories and the implanted ones began to blur terrifyingly. Was the scent of roses outside her window real, or just another echo? Was the faint scratching sound she heard in the walls just the house settling, or the desperate clawing of buried hands? Paranoia became her constant companion. The townsfolk's fearful whispers about Agatha took on new sinister dimensions. Had others known? Had they suspected? Did they look at Elena now and see the granddaughter of a murderer carrying the victim's curse? The box itself seemed to watch her. She covered it with a cloth, locked it in a cupboard, even shoved it deep into a closet under piles of blankets. But its presence was a physical cold spot in the house, a locus of dread she couldn't escape. The whispering would start again, faint but insidious whenever she drew near its hiding place. Not the cacophony of the first opening, but intimate, insidious murmurs directly in her mind. Sometimes it was Agatha's voice, cold and sharp, weak, sentimental, should have buried it deeper. Sometimes it was the victims choked with soil. So cold, so dark, why? Elena felt herself fraying at the edges. She stopped eating properly, she jumped at shadows. Conversations became difficult. Her mind constantly pulled back to the grave, to the suffocating darkness. She researched obsessively, digging through local archives, old newspapers, anything about Agatha's youth, the mansion's history, missing persons from decades past. She found a single chilling mention: a young maid named Cora, employed by Agatha's family, reported missing in the autumn of 1957. No body ever found. The description, dark hair, green eyes, a small silver locket, matched the woman in the memory. Cora. The name echoed in the hollow space the box had carved inside her. The whispering coalesced around it. Cora. Agatha's mental voice sneered. Foolish girl. Asked too many questions. Wanted the locket back. My locket. The image of the tarnished silver clasp, the skeletal hand, flashed in Eleanor's mind. It was the locket Cora had been buried with. The box wasn't just playing memories, it was somehow tied to the physical remains. An anchor point for the trapped horror. The compulsion grew stronger, an itch deep in her brain she couldn't scratch. Cora's plea, "Find me," was now a constant, desperate drumbeat. Eleanor knew where. The moonlit garden, beneath the thorny black roses. Agatha's prized, unnaturally dark blooms. Armed with a shovel she'd bought with trembling hands, Eleanor found herself standing in the neglected garden of the inherited Victorian mansion late one rain-lashed night. The air smelled of wet earth and decay. The black roses, glistening under the beam of her flashlight, seemed like clusters of clotted blood. The whispering in her mind was a roar now, a chaotic storm of Agatha's defiant fury and Cora's suffocating terror. The ground beneath the largest rose bush felt unnaturally soft, yielding. Digging was a nightmare. Every thrust of the shovel echoed the memory of Agatha burying Cora. Every spadeful of dirt she removed felt like she was exhuming her own sanity. The rain plastered her hair to her face, mingling with hot tears of terror and revulsion. The deeper she went, the colder the air became, the louder the whispers screamed. Agatha's voice was furious, desperate. "Stop! Leave it! It's mine! My secret! My house!" Cora's was a sobbing crescendo of relief and renewed terror. Yes, deeper, almost. He comes. He comes from the walls. He? Who was he? The question barely registered before the shovel struck something hard yet yielding. Not rock. Wood, rotted wood. Eleanor dropped to her knees, scraping away the mud with bare, freezing hands. A small crude coffin, little more than a box, emerged from the earth. The stench of decay, held at bay by the rain, now hit her full force, thick and nauseating. The whispering stopped. Utter silence, heavier than the grave soil, pressed down. With trembling fingers slick with mud and rain, she pried at the warped lid. It came away with a sickening crack. Inside, wrapped in the tattered remnants of a simple dress, were bones. Small, fragile human bones. And around the slender neck vertebrae, glinting dully even in the weak flashlight beam, was a tarnished silver locket shaped like a tiny, skeletal hand, its chain tangled amongst the ribs. Cora. Seeing the physical reality, the stark, pitiful remains of the woman whose death agony she'd experienced, whose terror lived inside her head, unleashed a wave of grief and horror so profound it stole Eleanor's breath. This wasn't just a memory, it was a life stolen, hidden, and now violently unearthed. As she stared frozen at the skeletal hand locket, a new sound began. Not a whisper. A dry, rasping rattle. It came from the bones. The jawbone, still loosely attached to the skull, seemed to shift. A puff of dust or something darker escaped the gaping mouth cavity. And then a voice, not in her mind but physically present, impossibly emanating from the skeletal remains. A voice like grinding stones and dead leaves, filled with a malice that dwarfed Agatha's cruelty. "Foolish child, you opened the box, you disturbed the earth, you woke me." The flashlight beam flickered wildly. The skeletal fingers inside the coffin twitched. The silver locket glowed with a sickly greenish light. The whispering storm in Eleanor's mind reignited, but now dominated by a new terrifying presence. Ancient, hungry, and enraged. Agatha hadn't just murdered Cora. She'd buried her on top of something else, something far older and darker. Something the obsidian music box was designed not just to contain memories, but to contain. And Eleanor, driven by the victim's implanted pleas, had just set it free. The last thing she saw before the flashlight died completely was the skeletal hand locket unlatch itself, the tiny jaws opening wide like a viper's, and the bones within the coffin beginning to stir with unnatural life, animated by the furious entity beneath. The suffocating terror of Cora's memory was nothing compared to the primal, soul-freezing dread that engulfed Elena now, standing alone in the stormy dark, knee-deep in an open grave, facing the horrifying truth. The gift with memory was merely the lure. The true inheritance was the ancient evil it had been guarding, and it was very, very awake. The rain lashed down, icy needles against her skin, but the cold radiating from the open grave was deeper, older, a void sucking the warmth from the world. The rasping voice from the bones vibrated through the wet earth, up her legs, settling like lead in her stomach. Slept so long, buried beneath the guilty, the box, my cage and my conduit. You fed me such delicious terror. The skeletal fingers scrabbled against the rotted wood of the small coffin, finding purchase. A forearm bone, then a humerus clad in scraps of decayed fabric, levered upwards. The skull turned slowly, empty sockets fixing on Elena. The greenish glow from the locket intensified, casting ghastly moving shadows on the crumbling earth walls of the grave. It wasn't just Cora's bones moving, it was the thing wearing them, puppeteering the pitiful remains. Agatha's furious mental shrieks were abruptly silenced, swallowed by the entity's overwhelming presence. Cora's voice was a faint, fading whimper drowned out. Only the ancient malice remained, filling Elena's mind, a crushing weight of hatred and hunger. "The box!" The grating voice echoed, both from the animated skull and inside her head. "Holds the key, but you hold the door." Understanding crashed over Elena colder than the rain. The obsidian music box wasn't just a recorder of Agatha's crime or a prison for Cora's final moments. It was a seal. A complex arcane lock binding this entity deep beneath the earth, using the potent psychic resonance of violent death and profound guilt as its power source. Agatha, in her arrogance or perhaps her own corrupted understanding, had used it to hide her murder, inadvertently strengthening the seal with Cora's terror. But Elena, by opening the box, by experiencing and internalizing that terror, had become attuned to its frequency. She hadn't just unlocked memories, she'd weakened the seal. And by digging up Cora's remains, disturbing the grave directly above the entity's prison, she'd shattered it completely. The animated skeleton hauled itself fully upright in the coffin, movements jerky yet unnervingly purposeful. Rainwater streamed over the yellowed bones, pooling in the ribcage, dripping from the jaw. The skeletal hand locket pulsed like a malevolent heart. Flesh, the entity hissed, the word thick with longing. Warm flesh, blood to stir these dry veins. A vessel, after so long. It took a step forward, bones crunching wetly in the mud at the bottom of the grave. It was coming for her. Panic, pure and primal, finally broke Eleanor's paralysis. She scrambled backwards, clawing at the slick sides of the grave, mud caking her hands, her clothes. The shovel. Where was the shovel? Her fingers brushed cold metal half buried in the muck. She seized it, heaving it upwards just as the bone hand, tipped with ragged fingernails still clinging to decayed skin, reached for her ankle. She swung wildly, blindly. The shovel connected with the skull with a sickening crack. Bone fragments flew. The green light flickered violently. A roar of pure ethereal rage filled the night, shaking the ground, silencing the storm for a terrifying second, but the skull, though dented, didn't shatter. The entity stumbled back more enraged than injured. The locket's glow flared, burning brighter. The damaged skull tilted, reassembling itself with a grotesque crackling sound, knitting bone fragments back together under the eerie light. Pain. It rasped, a perverse note of pleasure in its voice. Forgotten sensation. More. Give me more. It lunged again, faster this time. Eleanor screamed, a raw sound ripped from her throat, and swung the shovel like a baseball bat. It connected with the rib cage, splintering ribs, sending the skeleton sprawling back into the muddy coffin. She didn't wait. She turned and scrambled frantically up the side of the grave, mud sucking at her boots, her hands slipping on roots and wet earth. She had to get away. She had to get the box. It was the key. Maybe she could lock it again. The thought was desperate, insane. But it was the only lifeline she had. Behind her, the rattling wet sounds of the bones reassembling spurred her on. She hauled herself over the edge of the grave, collapsing onto the sodden lawn, gasping. The mansion loomed ahead, its windows dark, empty eyes. The box was inside, on the dining table. As she pushed herself up, a cold, impossibly strong hand closed around her ankle. She looked back. The skeleton was half out of the grave. One bony hand clamped like a vice on her leg, the green light from the locket illuminating its reconstructed skull in a hellish grin. Its other hand gripped the edge of the pit, hauling the rest of its frame upwards. Run, little vessel, the voice mocked, both from the skull and echoing inside her skull. Run, make the blood sing. With a strength born of sheer terror, Eleanor kicked out wildly. Her boot connected with the skull again. There was another crack, but the grip didn't loosen. She kicked again, screaming, twisting. Her foot slipped on the mud, but the sudden movement combined with another desperate kick finally broke the skeletal grip. She scrambled backwards on her hands and knees, then surged to her feet, sprinting towards the back door of the mansion. The rain and wind howled around her, masking the rattling pursuit she knew was close behind. She burst into the kitchen, slamming the door shut and fumbling for the lock. It clicked just as something heavy thudded against the other side. Wood splintered around the latch. Thud. The door shuddered in its frame. Eleanor didn't look back. She ran through the dark house, guided by the pervasive sense of cold emanating from the dining room. The box sat where she'd left it, the obsidian wood seeming to absorb the faint moonlight filtering through the window. Its lid was slightly ajar. The whispering was back, a chaotic blend of Agatha's panic, "No, not free, not him," Cora's fading whimpers, and the entity's triumphant, hungry growl. Crash. The sound came from the kitchen. The door was down. Heavy dragging footsteps accompanied by the wet click-clack of bone on hardwood echoed down the hallway, getting closer, fast. Eleanor snatched up the box. It was freezing, sucking the heat from her hands. The silver gears inside were visible through the gap in the lid, slick and dark, unmoving now but radiating pure malice. How? How did it work? How could she lock it again? The entity's voice boomed in her mind, laced with cruel amusement. Too late, vessel. The seal is broken. The box is mine to command now. A focus, a beacon. Soon all will hear my song. The dragging footsteps reached the dining room doorway. Eleanor whirled around. The skeleton stood there, reconstructed, rain dripping from its bones, mud smeared across its ribcage. The green light from the locket pulsed rhythmically, casting long, dancing shadows. It raised one bony hand, pointing a skeletal finger directly at her. "The box," it commanded, the voice resonating in the air and in her bones. "Give it, or join the dirt dweller." Cora's final memory, the suffocation, the dirt, the utter helplessness surged within Elena, a tidal wave of borrowed terror. But beneath it, something else sparked. Agatha's memory, not of the murder, but of after. A memory buried even deeper. Agatha, years later, pale and trembling, placing something small and metallic inside the box before closing it, whispering words in a language that scraped the ears. Words of binding, of containment. The hidden compartment, the skeletal hand clasp. With frantic fingers, her hands numb. From the box's cold, Eleanor pried at the tiny silver skeletal hand holding the lid closed. It resisted, fused with unnatural cold. The entity took a step forward, its footfall heavy on the floorboards. "Defiance," it hissed, amused. "Savor it." Eleanor poured every ounce of her terror, her rage, her borrowed memories of Agatha's guilt and Cora's agony into her fingers. She pulled. With a shriek of protesting metal, the skeletal hand clasp snapped off in her hand, burning cold. Beneath it, hidden in the base of the clasp's mount, was a tiny cavity. And within it a small folded piece of vellum covered in spidery blood-brown ink, the binding words Agatha had used, the final component of the seal. The entity roared a sound of pure fury that shattered the dining room window. It lunged. Eleanor didn't think. She dropped the clasp, snatched the vellum, and with a voice raw from screaming rain and terror, she began to shriek the words inscribed there. The language was guttural, alien, each syllable tearing at her throat like broken glass. As she spoke, the obsidian box in her other hand erupted with cold. Not the passive cold of before, but an active, aggressive frost that raced up her arm, burning with icy fire. The silver gears inside began to spin backwards with a tortured, metallic scream. The entity froze mid-lunge, its form flickering. The green light from the locket sputtered. A look of shock, then dawning horror replaced the malice on the skeletal face. "No!" The bellow shook the house. "The oath! The guilty flesh is gone! The seal cannot!" Eleanor kept screaming the words, pouring the last of her strength, her borrowed memories, her own soul, deep terror into them. The box was vibrating violently now, threatening to leap from her grasp. Frost coated her arm, her shoulder creeping towards her neck. The skeletal form of Cora began to collapse, bone by bone, clattering to the floor. The locket fell from the neck vertebrae, its green light dying to an ember. But the entity wasn't gone. A swirling vortex of darkness, shot through with veins of sickly green light, coalesced above the pile of bones, howling with unearthly fury. It pulsed, growing, reaching tendrils of shadow towards Elena. The box was pulling at it, the reversed gears creating a terrifying suction. The vortex resisted, straining against the pull. The words on the vellum ended. Elena had nothing left. The vortex surged forward, in a final desperate act, fueled by the memory of Cora's final plea and Agatha's desperate act of binding. Elena slammed the obsidian lid of the box shut. As the lid clicked closed, a silent concussion wave exploded outwards. The swirling vortex of darkness was ripped from the air, screaming, and sucked violently into the box with the sound of 1,000 souls being extinguished. The frost on Elena's arm shattered, falling away. The box fell from her nerveless fingers, hitting the floor with a heavy thud. Silence, utter, profound silence. The rain still fell outside. The wind still howled. But the oppressive dread, the whispering, the bone-deep cold, they were gone. The box lay on the floor, inert, obsidian once more. Just a box. Elena collapsed to her knees, trembling uncontrollably, staring at the pile of bones that had been Cora, at the dull silver locket lying beside them. The borrowed memories were still there. The suffocation, the terror, Agatha's cold eyes. But they were quieter now, muffled, contained like the entity. She had inherited more than a house and a box. She had inherited the guilt, the victim, and the guardian's burden. The music box wasn't just a gift with memory, it was a prison she had to keep sealed. And as she sat there shivering on the cold floor, the silence broken only by the storm outside, a single terrible certainty settled upon her. The binding was temporary, the entity was contained, not destroyed, and the box, now cracked faintly along one side from the strain, was waiting. The memories inside, both Agatha's and Cora's, were restless. And somewhere, deep within the obsidian, something ancient and hateful was already beginning to whisper again. The gift kept on giving. The memory was eternal. And the next time the lid opened, there might be no words left to close it. The silence in the grand, decaying dining room was no longer peaceful. It was the silence of a tomb holding something that refused to stay dead. A silence pregnant with the echo of screams yet to come. Elena looked at the box, then at the bones, and knew her life was irrevocably bound to both. A keeper of secrets too terrible to share, haunted not by the past but by the horrifying responsibility for a future where the music box might one day play its final, devastating tune. The gift with memory was now her eternal burden, and the memory it held most dearly was the promise of its own inevitable, terrifying return. The storm raged on, but the true tempest was only just beginning, locked away in obsidian and silver, waiting for the next careless hand to turn the key. Elena knew with chilling certainty that hand might one day be her own, driven by the insidious whispers already taking root again in the quiet corners of her mind, softer now, but persistent, a dreadful lullaby sung by the prisoner within the gift. Soon, vessel, soon. Story number 3. The oppressive silence of the old house wasn't truly silent. It was a vacuum filled with the frantic drumming of my own heart against my ribs. A frantic counterpoint to the slow, deliberate creak. Creak, creak coming from the hallway right outside my locked bedroom door. The sound of weight shifting on ancient floorboards that shouldn't be bearing any weight at all. Not at 3:17 a.m. Not when I was utterly alone or supposed to be. A fact coldly underlined by the absolute stillness of the air, thick and cloying like congealed oil. making each shallow, panicked breath I managed to suck in feel like drowning in dust and dread. The sour tang of fear sweat sharp in my nostrils, the darkness pressing in, absolute and smothering except for the thin, jaundiced sliver of moonlight slicing through a gap in the heavy velvet curtains, illuminating swirling motes of dust that danced like malevolent spirits above the threadbare rug. I'd followed the rules meticulously, hadn't I? The impossible, terrifying rules scrawled in shaky, spidery handwriting on a scrap of yellowed paper I'd found wedged behind the loose skirting board in this accursed guest room the moment I'd arrived, fleeing my own crumbling life only to find a different kind of ruin. To sleep in the green room and survive the night, you must observe these conditions. Lights extinguished by 10 p.m. precisely. Door locked with the brass key found atop the wardrobe. Turned 3 times counterclockwise. Window latched but curtains left parted exactly 1 inch. 1 glass of water from the bathroom tap only, placed on the nightstand. You must lie facing the door. Under no circumstances open your eyes if you wake before dawn, no matter what you hear or feel or smell. Do not leave the bed until the first bird sings. Disregard any sound resembling a human voice calling your name from within the house. Failure in any condition forfeits your safety. Asterisk, I'd done it all obsessively, checking and rechecking each step. The brass key cold and heavy in my trembling hand as I turned it the required 3 times. The metallic clunk echoing too loudly in the dead air. The single inch of moonlight measured with neurotic precision. The tap water tasting faintly of rust and earth as I forced it down. I'd lain rigid, staring at the dark outline of the door, my back prickling with the sensation of unseen eyes watching from the oppressive blackness behind me, jumping at every imagined sound, every settling groan of the old house's timbers, until exhaustion, a leaden weight pulling at my eyelids, finally dragged me down into a shallow, uneasy sleep, haunted by fragmented nightmares of grasping shadows and that relentless creaking. Waking came violently, not to dawn's light, but to that sound, creak, 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 just outside the door, closer than before, impossibly close, accompanied now by a new horror, a low, wet, guttural rasping, like rotten leather being slowly torn, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards and up the legs of the iron bedstead, freezing the blood in my veins. My eyes flew open in primal terror, instantly violating condition 5. The command not to look seared into my brain too late. The thin sliver of moonlight fell not on empty floorboards, but on it, a silhouette darker than the surrounding blackness, impossibly tall and skeletally thin, its elongated head brushing the ceiling, standing motionless right beside the bed, angled towards me, though it possessed no discernible face, only a terrible sense of focused predatory attention. The rasping wasn't breath, it was coming from the direction where a mouth should be, a slow rhythmic tearing sound that filled the suffocating room. Sheer mindless panic screamed through every nerve, urging me to run, to scream, to fling myself from the bed. But condition 7 screamed louder. Do not leave the bed until the first bird sings. Paralysis, cold and absolute, locked my muscles. I couldn't move, couldn't blink, couldn't even whimper, forced to stare fixedly at the door ahead as the monstrous shadow presence loomed beside me, radiating an aura of profound cold and ancient malice. The rasping sound growing subtly louder, more deliberate, as if it knew I was awake, knew I saw it, knew I was helpless. Time stretched into an agonizing eternity measured only by the pounding of my heart and that dreadful tearing respiration. Then the smell hit me, a nauseating wave of decay, of damp earth and long-buried things, of meat left too long in a sealed tomb, so thick I gagged silently, bile burning my throat. The shadow didn't move, yet I felt its cold intensify, a physical pressure against my skin like icy water soaking through the sheets. The rasping now vibrating deep in my own chest. It's waiting. The thought slithered through my frozen mind, waiting for me to break, to move, to scream, to look at it directly, or waiting for dawn. But dawn felt like a myth, an impossible promise in this timeless hell. Suddenly a new sound pierced the heavy silence, a faint, muffled thump from somewhere deep within the house, like a heavy book falling onto carpet, followed by a soft, unmistakable sigh, a sound of profound weariness. Condition 6 echoed like a death knell. Disregard any sound resembling a human voice calling your name from within the house. This wasn't my name, but it was undeniably human, undeniably inside. The sigh came again, closer now, just beyond the bedroom door, carrying an unbearable weight of sorrow and longing. The shadow beside me shifted infinitesimally, its head tilting almost imperceptibly towards the door, the rasping sound pausing for a single, breathless second. The sigh came a third time, right outside the locked door now, accompanied by a gentle, almost hesitant tap. Tap. Tap on the wood like fingernails brushing against it. A desperate, treacherous hope flared. Was it help? Some other trapped soul? Or something else, another player in this house's deadly game, luring me to break condition 7? The shadow's cold deepened, a warning, the rasping resuming, with a harsher, more insistent edge. The tapping stopped. Silence slammed down again, heavier than before, broken only by the thunder of my pulse in my ears and the shadow's horrible respiration. Then the faintest whisper, so close it seemed to originate inside my own skull, breathed rather than spoken. Let me in. It wasn't shouted, it wasn't menacing, it was achingly plaintive, filled with a loneliness that scraped raw against my terror. The brass key in the lock rattled softly, once, as if touched. Condition 6 screamed in my mind, disregard. But the sheer humanity of that whisper, that sorrow, was a hook in my soul, a siren song promising an end to the suffocating isolation. A shared burden in this nightmare. The shadow beside me remained utterly still, a statue of concentrated darkness, its presence a suffocating blanket of ice, the rasping now a constant grating drone that vibrated my teeth. The whisper came again. So cold. Please. Tears, hot and involuntary, welled in my wide open burning eyes, spilling over to track cold paths down my temples into my hair. The urge to move, to unlock the door, to offer solace, warred violently with the animal terror screaming to remain frozen, to obey the conditions, to wait for the impossible birdsong. The key rattled again, more insistently. Just open the door. The whisper pleaded, imbued with such profound despair it felt like a physical ache. I squeezed my eyes shut for a fraction of a second, a desperate, futile attempt to block it out, violating condition 5 anew. When I forced them open, the shadow hadn't moved, but the moonlight now glinted faintly on something slick and dark oozing from the general area where its feet might be, pooling slowly, silently on the floorboards beside the bed, spreading with unnatural speed, the smell of decay intensifying tenfold, choking me. The whispering voice outside shifted, the sorrow suddenly laced with a frantic edge. It's coming, hurry, open the door before it. The sentence ended in a choked gasp. Simultaneously, the shadow beside me leaned closer, the freezing aura intensifying until my skin burned with the cold, the rasping sound deepening into a guttural, bubbling snarl that vibrated the bed frame. The whisper outside became a terrified hiss. Too late! Followed by a sudden sharp scrabbling against the door, like frantic claws, then a sickening wet thud and silence. Absolute, deafening silence. The shadow straightened, the unbearable pressure easing slightly. The bubbling snarl subsiding back to the wet rasping. The pool of dark ichor stopped spreading, gleaming dully in the moonlight. Dawn was still an eternity away. The silence stretched, punctuated only by my own choked breathing and the shadow's dreadful presence. Had it dealt with the thing outside? Was I momentarily safer? Or was this merely the calm before a more intimate horror? The air remained frigid, thick with the smell of decay and a new metallic undertone. Blood? I dared not look down at the pool, dared not look sideways at the entity. I remained locked in my paralysis, staring fixedly at the door. The brass key now still in the lock, a mocking symbol of my imprisonment. Time lost meaning. Seconds bled into minutes, minutes into hours. Each one an agony of tension, every rustle of the heavy curtains. Had they moved? Was the gap still exactly 1 inch? Sparking fresh panic, every tiny creak of the house itself sounding like the precursor to another visitation. The shadow remained, an eternal sentinel of darkness radiating cold malice. The glass of water on the nightstand, untouched since I placed it, seemed to mock me, a cruel reminder of the mundane ritual that had failed to ward off this profound evil. I began to shiver uncontrollably, a deep bone-rattling tremor that started in my core and radiated outwards, my teeth chattering despite the cold sweat still slicking my skin. The shivering was involuntary, a physical rebellion against the enforced stillness threatening to jolt me off the bed. I clenched my jaw, biting down hard on the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper, focusing on the sharp pain to anchor myself against the overwhelming urge to move, to curl into a ball, to escape the freezing aura emanating from the figure beside me. The rasping seemed to synchronize with my shivers for a moment, a horrifying counterpoint, before settling back into its own rhythm. Faintly, so faintly I thought it was tinnitus born of terror. A new sound intruded, a distant, muffled dripping. It seemed to come from the direction of the hallway, slow and irregular. Plink. Silence. Plink. Plink. Silence. My mind conjured images of the slick pool beside the bed, leaking under the door. Or worse, of whatever remained of the whispering entity melting away. The shadow remained impassive, a monolith of darkness. The dripping continued, a maddening metronome in the suffocating quiet. Then a different sensation, a faint, almost imperceptible draft. It brushed against the sweat on my forehead, chilling it further. It came from the window. Had the latch failed? Had the single inch of gap somehow widened? Condition 3, window latched but curtains left parted exactly 1 inch. Had I failed? Was the seal broken? The draft, icy and carrying a faint sour scent of mildew from outside, seemed to confirm it. A fresh wave of terror washed over me. Had this minor deviation already damned me? Was the shadow's continued presence a sign that my protection was void? The rasping didn't change, the cold didn't lessen, but the sense of precarious safety I'd briefly clung to evaporated. The draft grew slightly stronger, teasing the edge of the heavy velvet curtain. making it flutter like a dying breath. Through the gap, the slice of moonlight seemed to dim as if clouded. I strained my ears, listening past the dripping, past the rasping, past my own frantic heartbeat. Was that a faint scratching? Not at the door now, but outside, beneath the window. Light, hesitant scrapes, like twigs against the glass, or fingernails. My fixed gaze on the door felt like a betrayal. The real threat might now be creeping up from below. Condition 7 held me fast. Do not leave the bed. But what if the window latch was failing? What if it got in? The scratching stopped. The draft died. The silence returned. Heavier, thicker. The shadow shifted beside me. Not a movement I saw, but a change in the quality of its presence, a subtle intensification of its focus, its head tilting fractionally downwards, towards me. The rasping deepened, taking on a wet, gurgling quality. The pool of ichor beside the bed seemed to ripple, though no draft touched it. A new sound emerged from the shadow layered beneath the rasping, a low subsonic hum that vibrated my bones, a sound of immense, ancient hunger. It leaned closer still, the freezing aura becoming painful, like needles of ice piercing my skin. The smell of decay was overwhelming, mixed now with the coppery tang of my own blood from my bitten cheek. I could feel its attention, a tangible force boring into the side of my face, willing me to turn, to meet its non-existent gaze. Condition 5 screamed, "No!" I squeezed my eyes shut again, a reflex of utter terror, pressing my face harder into the pillow, violating the rule instantly and completely. The humming intensified, vibrating the mattress. The rasping became a wet snarl. The cold became agony, searing my exposed skin. I felt a pressure immense and intangible pushing down on my chest, making it impossible to breathe. I was going to suffocate here, frozen in terror, my lungs burning. "Open your eyes," a desperate, insane part of my mind shrieked. "See it! Face it!" But the primal survival part, clinging to the shredded remnants of the conditions, screamed louder. "No! Don't look! Wait for the bird!" The pressure increased, crushing. Black spots danced behind my closed eyelids. I was dying, right here, right now. Not from violence, but from the sheer, oppressive, supernatural weight of its proximity and my own terror. Then a miracle. Faint. So faint it was almost subliminal, a single clear, pure trill. It pierced the suffocating silence and pressure like a shard of glass. A bird. The first bird. Song. Condition 7. Do not leave the bed until the first bird sings. It had sung. Dawn. The pressure on my chest lessened infinitesimally. The humming receded slightly, the rasping softened. Dared I hope? Dared I move? The single note hung in the air, fragile and beautiful, then faded. Silence rushed back in, but the crushing weight didn't return immediately. Another bird answered, closer this time. A short, questioning chirp. Then another. A hesitant dawn chorus began, tentative at first, then gaining strength, weaving a tapestry of sound that seemed to push back the oppressive silence and the cloying stench of decay. The freezing aura began to recede, pulling back like a tide. The rasping sound diminished, becoming fainter, more distant. I risked opening my eyes, the barest slit. Still staring rigidly ahead at the door, terrified of what I might see peripherally. The slice of moonlight was still there, but it was different, paler, cooler, the grey light of dawn, not the sickly yellow of deep night. The pool of ichor beside the bed was gone, vanished without a trace. The air, while still cold, no longer burned with supernatural frost. The shadow, was it less dense, less present? The The birdsong grew louder, more confident, a chorus of life banishing the night's horrors. The rasping faded to nothing. The crushing weight lifted entirely from my chest. I gasped in a deep, shuddering breath of the cool, damp dawn air, tasting its sweetness, its normalcy. I remained frozen for several more minutes until the room was filled with the unmistakable grey light of morning, the shadows retreating to normal corners. Cautiously, muscles screaming in protest from hours of rigid tension, I turned my head, millimeter by agonizing millimeter, towards the side of the bed where the entity had stood. There was nothing, only the worn rug, the peeling wallpaper, the empty space. The brass key gleamed dully in the lock. I had survived the night. I had followed the conditions. I had not looked. I had not left the bed, shakily, tears of relief and residual terror streaming down my face. I slowly, painfully swung my legs over the side of the bed, my bare feet touching the icy floorboards. The glass of water on the nightstand was untouched, its surface perfectly still. I stood, my legs trembling violently, and took a step towards the door, the brass key beckoning. As I reached out, my hand shaking uncontrollably, I glanced down. There on the floorboards where the pool of ichor had been, invisible in the darkness but starkly clear in the dawn light, was a single perfect dark crimson fingerprint, still slightly damp. It pointed directly at the bed.